All right, folks, let's begin this evening. Thank you for being here, despite the dark and stormy night. Glad that you're here. Open your Bibles to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53. I think we got into the first 4 or 5 verses, but if it's all right with you, I want to start at the top and just take it as a whole this evening. Isaiah 53. I want to start, which I don't usually do this, by reading the chapter in its entirety. And then I'll make a quick point, and then we'll dive into it starting in verse 1. Isaiah 53, starting in verse 1. Isaiah writes, this is the King James, so yours might be a little different. Who has believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of dry ground. He has no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. Isaiah 53, verse 6. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Verse 10. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. And by his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out his soul unto death. He was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. That's Isaiah 53 in its entirety. It's only 12 verses long. I wonder, we're familiar with the text. I want you to think about how familiar you are with it. Think about your being familiar with it. Every single one of those verses that we read, which, mind you, when Isaiah wrote it, he did not have verses in mind. He didn't chop it up into 12 fortune cookie-sized sayings. He just had one long narrative he was writing. But we, in our way we've broken up the Bible, for great convenience, I'm not knocking it, we've compartmentalized it, we've chopped it up. And so as we look at that as 12 parts to the whole, probably, if you scan through it, you'll find something in every one of those verses, if not whole verses entirely, where you are familiar with the text. There's probably not a single verse in there where you can't say, oh, I've never heard that line before. We're very familiar with Isaiah 53. We're used to hearing a piece here, a part there, a half a verse here, a 2 or 3 verse section there, that we don't often consider the whole monologue as one complete thought. So I want to do that tonight. I assume we'll finish, it's only 12 verses. We should finish Isaiah 53. We may go into 54 as well. But I want us, as we're walking through this, to be mindful of, all right, here's what he's saying here. Here's a sentence in this text that we're very familiar with. Look how it follows the sentence that just precedes it. Look how it leads into what's following. Notice how he says this for a reason. It's not just because it sounds pretty. He's not just nakedly trying to pull at your heartstrings. He's saying what he's saying because, like anybody who says anything, one sentence follows another. Logical communication. You say one thing, it leads to the next thing, which leads to the next thing, which leads to the point that you're making before you move on to your next topic, which is chapter 54. So let's see this text that we know so well individually as one whole unit. All right? Isaiah 53, verse 1. And even then, we start at the beginning of the chapter. It's not the beginning of the thought. To start with Isaiah 53, you have to go back to 52, but we won't because we already did it last week. But 52 shows us the same picture. You get a picture of the Savior, it's flipped. In Isaiah 52, the Savior is first glorified and then shown in his abused state. In this chapter, he is abused and then glorified. But you introduced to it in the early chapter, previous chapter 52, where Isaiah calls him the arm of the Lord that God reveals to us, and how we see him raised up on this high level, this high esteemed position, this king on his high and lofty throne. And then we look really closely at him. We don't see a face that's radiant and majestic. We don't see this shining, sparkling golden crown on his head. We don't see this beautiful ruby robe that he's wearing. What we see is a man who is red, but not from the color of his garment, but from the blood that is pouring out of his broken and battered and bleeding body. We see a figure that should not be, by looks of it, on a throne. Because his throne in this context is not his heavenly throne. It is the cross at Golgotha's hill. That's where he is high and lifted up. That's where he's elevated. What Isaiah sees in chapter 52 is this glorified being. And then he tells you why he's so glorified, what he did, what he went through to go to that lofty position. And it was to be beaten and bloodied and murdered. That's the grotesque picture that Isaiah paints at the end of the previous chapter. And then having painted that picture, then he pauses and he says, what for? To whom? Here's this person that dies this horrific and yet heroic death. A heroic death implies somebody being died for. This firefighter, look how burned and mangled and disfigured his body is because he went into a burning building and he pulled out several people. Well, who did he save? Who did he rescue? To go through all of that, was it worth it? We shouldn't talk like that. We shouldn't think like that, but we can't help but think like that. Look at this sacrifice. My mind goes to scales. I want to see if the scales balance. Who did he save? Well, look at this beautiful family. Look at this child that would have died in the fire. Had this fireman not run in to rescue them? Okay, here is this glorified king who receives his throne because he is murdered in the most horrific and abusive in every possible way. Physically, emotionally, psychologically, abused, battered, bloodied, and killed. For whom has he gone through this? That's the question that opens Isaiah 53. To whom is this arm of the Lord revealed? Who are the people that he's dying for? Surely they're worth it. No, actually, on the far opposite end of the scale, they are not worth it at all. Now, from our vantage point, obviously they're worth it, or he wouldn't have died for them. But from our vantage point, as we weigh in terms of what kind of people that we're dealing with, not good people. Verse 153. Who has believed this report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? Verse 2. He shall grow up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of dry ground. He has no form nor comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Let's take it one at a time. He shall grow up before him, him being the Father. The Son of the Father grows up before the Father, not as this great and mighty cedar of Lebanon. And that's in the context of this verse. Because he has no form nor comeliness, that when we see him, we would desire him. If you were going to make him a metaphor of a tree, you would not describe him as this giant, huge, ancient-looking oak tree that when you're driving through an old part of an old town, you stop and you marvel. Oh, this tree must have been here for hundreds of years. Look how big it is. It's so majestic. Take my picture in front of it. This is not that kind of a tree. This is my Bible says, tender plant. What's your Bible say? Anybody say twig?
Young, like a young plant.
Like a young plant. He is small. You might even describe him as frail kind of looking. He is not an imposing, statuesque, Adonis-looking figure. And that's the next phrase. Oh, after a root out of dry ground. He's this thing that grows up in this barren wasteland of sin. He's this tree of life. Then the next phrase. He has no form nor comeliness. He has no outward appearance, no attractive qualities, so that when you see him, if you saw him passing in the street, you'd think, that guy must be important. You see that guy? You see the way he carries himself? He looks the part. What is it that they said about King Saul in terms of his description?
Handsome, tall, looked like a king.
Yes. He passed the eye test. When you saw Saul, he was designed to be, almost by nature, he was designed to be that guy on the hill while the army is fighting. And the enemy army would see him and say, that's their king? He's humongous. He's head and shoulders above all the rest of them. Look how imposing he is. He looks the part. I mean, he was nuts, but he looked the part. Meanwhile, who succeeded Saul as king of Israel? Now, what is that famous phrase when we talk about David in terms of his appearance vis-a-vis Saul? What do we hear? When the prophet goes looking for the next king, he goes looking for the next Saul. He goes looking for the next big, giant, imposing figure. Who does he find? What does David look like? He looks like a short, scrawny, red-headed little twerp. But God, what is the phrase? You know it. You've heard it since VBS.
God looks at the heart.
God does not look at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart. This is the one that the prophet says, this is the guy? Is this even a guy yet? And God says, I don't care what he looks like. I care what he is. You don't see Jesus and say, that guy looks like a king. He did not look like a king. He just looked like an average guy. But this average-looking guy is the most extraordinary person that there has ever been. And I don't just mean because by nature he's the God-man. I mean by the things that he does. By the things he will allow to be done to him as an act of sacrifice for others. Who he is in his character. Not who he is by birth. By birth, he's the Son of God. By character, he's a child, a humble servant of God. That's the example we emulate. So when we see him, there's no beauty that we would desire him. Don't be looking for that. You're not going to get that from him. My Bible uses the word comeliness. The word is magnificence. There's no majesty. Same idea. There is no radiance about him that screams king. Instead, verse 3. Maybe because we don't see anything remarkable about him, it's easier for us to reject him. Have anybody? And it's not real. I mean, it's a real thing, but it's not Jesus. Is everyone familiar with the, what's it called? The Shroud of Turin? Is that what it's called? That cloth where someone was buried in, and you know the imprint of his body is kind of etched into it, so you can see with the light and stuff. And it depicts an average-looking Jewish man of around the time period. And people say, "Look, this is Jesus. This is Jesus." Well, it's not Jesus. It doesn't match. It doesn't fit for various other dating reasons. But people look at that, they extrapolate from that a three-dimensional image of what the guy would look like, and it's. I mean, since the shroud is not Jesus, the timeline doesn't match up. It's not Jesus. But even if it was, that's basically what Jesus would have looked like. That's your average, olive-skinned, Judean man of that era and time period. Has everyone seen that image, that 3D extrapolated image of what they think Jesus would have looked like? Okay, he doesn't look like what your Catholic friend has in his house where he's ripping open his heart and or his chest, there's a heart right there. He's some white guy with a forked beard. That's not what Jesus would have looked like. But if you Google what Jesus really looked like, you'll probably get this image of some guy with a beard and short hair, and he kind of has one of these expressions. That. And when you see it, your first thought is, yeah, there's nothing remarkable about that. That's the point exactly. Like, that's it. That's the idea. I mean, it's not like that's a feature or a bug. It's just what it is. You're not supposed to see him. He wasn't designed by the Creator who fashioned his looks to be appealing to the eyes. If you want to be attracted to Jesus, you have to be attracted to his mind, to what he says, to what he teaches. His followers were not Instagram followers. They were students. They wanted to learn. And so because he didn't match the expectations of the superficial people, he is despised. Verse 3. And rejected by men. And because of that, he becomes a man of sorrows. He becomes a person, my Bible says, acquainted with grief. What does yours say? Same thing? He becomes a person so familiar with feeling bad all the time that it is considered his closest companion. He had Peter, James, and John, and Andrew. He had the other apostles. He sometimes went alone to pray. But no matter where he was or what he did, the one who was always with him was sadness. Well, I understand it. I do. I get it. He's the only sinless person on the planet. Literally everybody else is sinful. You'd feel lonely too. Yes, Mark?
Matthew, do you think that as a young boy, a 10, 12-year-old boy, that Jesus knew that this prophecy was about him?
I think he certainly had some idea of a lot of those prophecies. I mean, we have the one account that we have of Jesus as a young man, a young person, not as a baby or as an adult. He's talking with the scholars and he's talking about the law. And then when his parents confront him, you know, you should be with us. Why aren't you with us? Well, first of all, why did you lose your own child? But he says to them, don't you know I must be about my Father's business? Now, you could read that as just a divinely minded, you know, God-fearing young person who considers God his father. But that was not a commonplace idea among the Jews to think of God as their father. Abraham is their father, if you ask them. So there's something deeper seated there. So my answer is the Bible doesn't give a lot of specificity on the matter, but I think there was a pretty good reason to think that he knew what he was and who he was. And you don't have to read much to find. I mean, Isaiah's prophecy about the suffering servant It's very famous now. It was very famous then. It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's not just providence. It's commonplace that the eunuch was reading from Isaiah and wondering about what it meant because it was such a huge topic to discuss. So I think it's a fair suggestion. Yeah. 53:3. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and we turned our faces away from him. We hid our faces from him. Now contrast that with the previous chapter where we look up and we see this man on a throne high and lifted up and we examine him closely and it says kings shut their mouths at him. They see him and they're shocked. Now, the closer we look, the more we don't even want to look. We turn away from him. But that's not really what he's talking about here. He's not talking about, he's so disgusting, I can't look. He's not talking about, I'm ashamed, I can't look. He's saying, I don't want to look at this person. That's the attitude of us toward him. Mind you, it should be the other way around. Because as I just said, he's the only sinless person, and we're all a bunch of sinful people. If anything, he should not be wanting to look at us. And yet he came to wash our feet, yet he came to serve our needs, yet he came to heal our iniquities, our physical ones first, and then our spiritual ones later. He's looking at us, and yet in response to that, we see him, and because he doesn't pass our smell test, because he doesn't line up to what we want him to be, we turn our faces away from him in rejection and despising. He is despised. And we, my Bible says, esteemed him not. We didn't think of him as anything at all great or good. We didn't lift him up even one level above ourselves. In fact, we despised him, a word which means to lower than yourself, to bring down. We brought him down. We didn't lift him up. Verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. I want you to take verse 4 and put it on top of verse 3 and just see how much they mirror one another. Verse 3 again, he's despised and rejected of men. Who is he? That's what we do, but who is he? While we're rejecting him, while we're despising him, he's a man of sorrows. He's acquainted with grief. We hide our faces from him. We don't esteem him like he deserves to be. Verse 4, he bears our griefs. He has plenty of his own. We are rejecting him. We are despising him. We want nothing to do with him. We turn away from him. What does that do to the psyche of a person? To have all of your peers turn away from you. That hurts. He is acquainted with grief. He takes his own griefs and puts them aside because now he wants to worry about all of ours. He is not without his own, but he bears all of ours. He carries our sorrows. Did he have sorrows? Yes, but mine were more important. He made room for mine. He carries our sorrows. And in response to that, we did not fall at our feet and thank him. We did not immediately rush to do whatever he said. No, we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Here he is, this crestfallen, beaten down person, suffering and ultimately dying on a cross. And what did we do in response? We pointed at him and we said, he's getting what he deserves. Is he getting what he deserves? He's getting what I deserve. But I don't even have the time or the humility to consider that. No, I'm looking at him and I'm not even thinking better him than me. I'm just thinking, yeah, that's what you get, you blasphemer. You person who has the audacity to say you're the Son of God. You're getting what you deserve. You have been smitten of God. That's what they said to him. He calls for God. Let's see if God will deliver him, thinking he won't. That's where we left off last week, now verse 5. But he was wounded for our transgressions. We did esteem him smitten of God. Now, why would God smite somebody? Does God smite innocent people? No, the devil does, but God doesn't. Book of Job is your cross-reference. Does God spank the innocent? No, he spanks the guilty. Does God smite innocent people? No. So when we say he is smitten of God, we are looking at Jesus and we're saying, you're guilty, you're getting what you deserve. But he is wounded. His smiting is for my transgressions. He's getting what I deserve. It's not his own crimes, but mine that he's paying for. He's bruised for my iniquities. The chastisement of our peace, the spanking a father gives his son as punishment for his crimes in order to reconcile with his son again, so that when he gets his spanking, he'll say he's sorry, and then you can get the embrace, and then everything's fine again. That chastisement for peace that I needed, that I didn't deserve because I'm guilty as sin, for my crimes, he took the spanking so that I could get the hug. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his, my Bible says, stripes, we're healed. What does your Bible say? Wounds. His being black and blued for you. His battered, bloodied body is what you deserve, but he got instead. The word bruised, where is it? Bruised for our iniquities, literally crushed or crumbled, broken into a million little pieces. I don't know because I don't have my Hebrew translations in front of me. I wonder if that's the same or maybe etymologically related to the word for humble, which often is just, it could be translated as crushed in the Old Bible. So I'm going to make a mental note of that to look that up. I'm curious about that. Or if you have a quick Google, you can do it yourself and just yell it out to me while I'm in the middle of talking. If the word in verse 5, humble, crushed or bruised, is in any way related to humbled. Either way, he was for our iniquities. Verse 6. Wait. Somebody read John 19, verse 1. Please. John 19, verse 1. Because Isaiah just uses he uses a lot of general phrases. Bruised, chastisement, wounded. What are we talking about here? John 19, 1.
Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him.
All right. You can be whipped, and it doesn't tickle. You can be whipped with a cat o' nine tails, where the end of the whip has several branching other whips onto it. So it's like 5 to 9 whips for the price of one. Every lashing is like immediately getting 8 other lashes all at once. Or you can be scourged. You can be scourged by the Roman scourge, which is not just a whip, and it's not just a cat o' nine tails. It's a whip where the tips of each individual leather strap, are tied with bits of shaven, sharpened bone, or bits of glass, or a pointy rock, something that would equate to like an eagle's talon. So you're not just being whipped, which just like lacerates the skin. You're being mauled by like a giant animal's claw. That when it hits your back, as your back is stretched very tightly, those claws dig into your back, and then they crack the whip back and they rip. And they don't just do this once, but they'll do it over and over and over. And the Jews have this thing, well, we can flog a man 39 times. You can't flog him 40 times. And they would abuse that. They'd flog you 39 times and pass the baton to someone else to do it 39 times. And you get flogged 400 times, which is completely contrary to the law, but that was the Jews at the time. But the Romans, they didn't have any custom. They'll go until they're done. And when they're done, it's either you're an inch away from death, or if they just don't care, they'll just go ahead and kill you. But they have the ability to stop you just before you die. But I don't care. It doesn't matter. You take me from within an inch of my life, I might as well be dead. I'm just not dead yet. In other words, they're giving me just enough life to get to the cross where I'll finally go ahead and die. But if I just lay there, I'll die anyway. I'll bleed out. I will eventually die. The moment the flogging, the scourging is over, the death sentence has already been done. I'm already a dying man. It's just a matter of time. And while that whip is cracking and being drawn back, and those talons are digging in and ripping back, your flesh is being thrown into the air like confetti. Your blood is misting up into the air. And you just have to lay there and take it. His stripes, his unimaginable visual scarring for my healing, Isaiah says. And who are we? Are we at all worthy of this? Are we good children in a burning fire? Verse 6. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. We're not deserving, which is why this is happening. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. You see, if we all had not committed iniquity, none would need to be laid on him. So because we are sheep who's gone astray, he had to come down and die for us. Every inch of his entire human life, up to and including his horrific death, is because I sinned and brought him down here. At first, to teach me with his life what I should have been doing, with his ministry, with his life, showing me what kind of person I was supposed to be, what my attitude should have been like. And then when I rejected that and I killed him, he saves me. Verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted. We're not deserving. He's innocent, yet he opened not his mouth. He's not deserving of this. Verse 6. And yet while he's in the middle of it, not once does he speak up and say, I don't deserve this. It's true, but he doesn't say it. Not once does he ask for mercy or pity or a break. He doesn't say anything. Like a sheep that goes to its shearer says nothing, mute, so he opens not his mouth. Because that's all the Isaiah prophet, that's all the Holy Spirit inspires him to regard him as. Just a sheep to the slaughter. He is so much more than that. He is the Son of God. He is the divine in human form. But when it comes to, I'm giving you a command, this is what you're going to do. And he goes to the garden, he says, is there any other way? And the answer is no, this is the way. That's it. Once that's decided, you are just a sheep to the slaughter. You must do what your Father in heaven tells you. And this is what he tells him. This is what he does. And he does it without a hint of complaint. He doesn't open his mouth at all. Despite all the injustices done to him, he doesn't say a word with regards to it. Somebody read 1 Peter 2, 21 through 24, please. 1 Peter 2, 21 through 24.
Matthew, that
Yes.
word you're talking about has etymology based on being humble.
There you go. Yeah, same as crushed, I'll bet.
Or
Yeah.
contrite.
Yeah. Often you hear the word humble, and you could easily translate it in the Hebrew, maybe in the Greek, I don't know, as crushed. A person who is completely no longer standing on their own, which is an act of pride. You're completely crushed. Either you do it willingly or it's done to you, but that's the idea. So yeah, that works there. Good, I'm glad you looked that up. 1 Peter 2, please, somebody. 21 through 24.
For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed.
That's basically Peter's summary of Isaiah 53. I mean, he lifts phrases from it and just picks and chooses parts from the rest of the Old Testament to draw that point. That text that he just read begins with, he left us an example that we should follow in his steps. That's the part we ignore. We're very happy sitting over here and feeling bad that he's doing all this, and we're amazed that he didn't open his mouth. Meanwhile, we have a slight injustice against us, and we make sure we shout it to the world. We say to everybody, but then we say, amazing how Jesus is just, you can sit there and just be so quiet. Do you know what this guy did to me yesterday? And whatever he did to you, which is a real thing he did to you, does not compare to what they did to him. And yet he said nothing, and we can't wait to shout to Facebook all the things that have happened to us today. Shut up. Get over yourself. Get off social media because it's toxic if that's all you do with it, and appreciate that he did something that you would do as he did. You're not supposed to sit in the stands and say, wow, look at what he did. You're not a spectator. You're a student. You're not an Instagram follower of Jesus. You're an actual follower of Jesus. You got to do as he did. He left you an example so that when he was reviled, he did not revile back. When he was threatened, he said nothing. He did nothing. He just allowed it to happen. And instead, he just trusted God would handle it. I'm so glad Peter adds that, because if he didn't say that, then you could easily, if you wanted to, you could say, well, I'm not the one dying for humanity. I'm not going through all that. I'm going through something else totally different, apples and oranges. But Jesus, yeah, he was going through something big. And yet, what he did left us an example. And what he did was to show us that I'm going to trust the Father to sort all this out and to make all this right. And that's what I need to do. Whether it's a petty grievance over here or some big problem over here, I just allow the Father. And once I turn it over to the Father, suddenly I don't need to be vengeful anymore. I don't need to right every wrong anymore. And then I'm actually humble. That's actually what God wants. A lot of people think that they're being humble and they think they're living righteously. And they're going around rattling sabers and fighting battles. But God has told you, vengeance is mine, I will repay. So every time you try to fight your own battle and get your own vengeance, all you're doing is you're telling God, I got this. And that's pride. Be humble. He left you the example of humility in the most extreme case, so that anything that falls below it also qualifies. He was, Isaiah 53:7, he was beaten and abused. And he was so 3 years after, maybe 2 years after, he sat on a mountainside and he said, love your enemies. Do good to them that hate you. Bless them who persecute you. Pray for them that despitefully use you. Well, that's easy to say, but you don't know what I've gone through, I might say to the Lord in my arrogance. And he could say to me, have you read what I went through? Because he was persecuted. He was reviled. He was attacked. And he had the chance to take his Sermon on the Mount and put his money where his mouth was. And he did. When he was abused by these people who sinned, he allowed them to attack him so that he could die to save them from the punishment for the crime of killing him. Verse 9. No, verse 8. Verse 8. The injustice of it all. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? He was cut off of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people, he was stricken. Throughout his trial, he was treated unfairly, illegally, and unjustly. It wasn't a fair trial. It doesn't matter. Don't jump to the end of the story and think, well, he had to die. He had to die, so it's good that he died. It's not good that he died. It's good for you, but it's not good that he died. You get to take advantage. And I use those words very particularly. You get to take advantage of his death, which was murder, which was cruel and wicked, done by sinful hands. And everything about it was wrong and unjust and unfair. When they arrested Jesus, what time of day was it? Was it morning, noon, or night?
Morning.
Well, was the sun up or down? You particular person. Yeah, being pedantic over there. Yeah, it was not. It was dark. It was nighttime. It wasn't sun up, middle of the day, where everybody's hustling and bustling. They did it in secret. They did it at night. That's against the custom of the law. When they arrested him, who was the one who led them to Jesus so they could find him in the first place? Was it just some random guy they found on the street? Was it some unbiased person? Who led them to Jesus? No, you know these are not hard questions. Judas did. He was arrested on the account of one of his own gang, a person with bias. That was against the custom of the law when it comes to arresting people. He was tried in the middle of the night in secret against the custom of the law. He was tried by the high priest himself. So there's no possibility of appeal. You're going straight to the Supreme Court against the custom of the law. He was tried with a conspiracy that was brought about by trumped up charges and false witnesses against the 10 Commandments themselves. He was tried and convicted by a quid pro quo with the Roman governor. If not against the law, then certainly uncouth in the Jewish custom. When in the middle of his trial, Matthew 26, in the middle of the trial, the high priest, in a fit of anger, rips his clothing, which should have immediately caused a recess to happen because he lost his cool. You got to be calm. You got to be unbiased, and yet the trial just keeps rolling without any stop. No crier goes out to the people to say, we have arrested this person. Does anyone want to speak in his defense? No one speaks in his defense. He wasn't given the right to have anyone speak in his defense against the custom of the law when it comes to trials. Every single thing about it was dirty, and it stank to heaven. Verse 8, he was taken. My Bible says from prison. Take that phrase from oppression, which is really what it means. Separate it for a second. He was taken from judgment, and that led to his oppression. He was treated unfairly because judgment was taken away from him. And so who's going to speak on his behalf? Who will declare for his generation? He was cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of my people. That's why he was stricken. Somebody read, please. In fact, David, if you don't mind, David reads. Read Psalm 143, verses 1 and 2. I don't know if you used this one in your class a while back, but Psalm 143, verses 1 and 2.
Says, hear my prayer, O Lord, listen to my supplications. Answer me in your faithfulness and in your righteousness. And do not enter into judgment with your servant, for in your sight no man living is righteous or justified.
God is the judge who has the right to judge you. And so it is on us to say occasionally to God, please don't. But you could flip that around and realize the lesson that's kind of underneath the surface is that no man has the right to judge God. Never has God said to us, please don't judge me. We don't have the right to put God on trial. And yet Jesus, God, allows himself to go on trial. And they don't even play fair with him. This is your one chance to put God on trial, and they make a mockery of it. Somebody read John 19, 10 and 11. Listen to the Lord's. This is when he does speak. He's mute and quiet before those unjust and unlawful, not even the real high priest people. And then when he goes before Pilate, a man whose authority he does recognize, because he is the actual ruler over Judea as a Roman delegate, he does speak to him, not to speak in his defense, but just to answer his questions. Listen to what he says about his role, Jesus' role in all of this, vis-a-vis being God and can he be judged. John 19, 10 and 11.
So Pilate said to him,
Speak to me, Pilate said, don't you realize I have the power to either free or crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin.
Why is it that the person who handed him over to Pilate, which is the Jewish Sanhedrin, the ruling council, why is it they're guilty of the greater sin in the Lord's, the judge's esteem? It's because he recognizes they had no power over him. First of all, he wasn't even the real high priest. It was a puppet high priest who was appointed by the Roman leaders. So they didn't have any authority anyway. And they had broken half a dozen rules to get him in that position anyway. So he didn't recognize their authority at all, which is partially why he didn't say a word. Pilate's authority he does recognize from a human's perspective. And so he'll respond to him and he'll point out the hierarchy that God establishes, that you have your power over this ruler, of this realm, as ruler because God put that there. You would have no power except it was given to you from above. They have no power, period, in discussion. They turned me over to you unjustly, unlawfully. They're guilty of the greater sin. Notice he doesn't let him off the hook. He's got sin too. But they're guilty of the greater sin in the Lord's esteem. That's kind of what we're reading here. Judgment was taken away from him. He was just oppressed for no good reason. Yes, Mark?
Matthew, in Matthew 27, Jesus did make a statement.
That's right.
The governor asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And he said, it is as you say.
Yeah, that's true.
Is that...
It doesn't really go against what Isaiah is saying. He doesn't say anything in his defense.
It didn't go against what he's saying. But that's kind of what tipped the scales?
Oh, you mean to make the high priest angry?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, he was guilty when he walked in the room. That was already decided. But if there was any, forget the plan of God and all that. This is just a man going through a sham trial. If there was any chance of him getting out of it, that was the end of it. Because from their perspective, he's a blasphemer. King of the Jews, that was the Messiah they were waiting on. And he's saying, I'm the one. And they're saying, you ain't, you're a liar. Not only King of the Jews, but you're saying you're the Son of God. Right. Verse 9. And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. This is two clauses slapped together with a word that really is poorly translated. But let's start at the beginning. He made his grave with the wicked and the rich in his death. Those two phrases in that one half, parallelism. He made his grave with the wicked and the rich in his death. He's really saying the same thing in two different ways, but you can look at it like this if you want to split it apart. The Romans' idea, after they crucify you, first of all, it was a remarkable thing, and I mean that literally. They remarked upon it. It was unusual for Jesus to die so soon, despite hours on the cross, to die so quickly, because you're supposed to lay up there and just die for hours and hours, if not days and days. You just lie up there in exposure, and the crows will come and pick you apart. So it was a remarkable thing that he died so quickly as he did. Which is why when they went to break the legs, they found he was already dead. You go to break the legs to accelerate the asphyxiation, so you hurry up and die, because it was a holiday and the Jews cared more about that than they did killing the Son of God. So it was a strange thing that they found him already dead, because the idea was, we'll leave him up there for a long time, we'll come back, and after they're dead, they would just dig a hole and just dump them all there. It was a rare... We've got in our heads this hill with 3 crosses. And there's not a Baptist church in the country that doesn't have some fixation on this emblem near their building. So we have this idea, but it was very rare for the Romans to go through the process of just killing 3 guys. They would have had several people in the prisons waiting, and then they would have had a bunch of crosses all over the place. Oh, you got to be kidding! I just started. So they would have been killing a lot of people. We know the 3 because we're told he was here, and there was one on the right and one on the left, and they both play a role in the account that's told to us. This one mocks, this one repents, the other one doesn't. But it's possible there were many others. It's possible that there weren't, but it's possible there were many others, because the idea of crucifixion, among many other things, is after they're finally all dead, they drag them down and they just dump them in a big giant grave, just a big mass grave. Nobody gets ceremony. No one gets pomp and circumstance. They're criminals. Most of the people who were involved here were, and certainly in this case, other than Jesus, were insurrectionists. They were plotting insurrection against Rome or something. That's why they're being crucified. A Roman execution versus stoning or something. So, and that's officially Jesus' execution is Roman, not Jewish. So these people, they're enemies of the state, so they're just all dumped in a body. So that would have been Jesus' death. That would have been how he was buried. That would have been how it would have happened. He would have had his grave with the wicked. That was planned for him. He's making his grave with the wicked. But it was from the rich in his death. Who might that be a reference to? The rich in his death.
The one that gave him his tomb.
And who was that? Do you know?
Joseph.
Joseph of Arimathea. Yes. Yep. Somebody over here said it. Yes. So this rich person, this disciple, and along with him, who was the other one? Who came to Jesus by night? Barnabas. No, not Barnabas. Nicodemus. Yeah. Nicodemus. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus both appeal to the authority to get Jesus off the cross, to bury him in a proper way. Because he wasn't an insurrectionist. This whole thing was a sham and they knew it anyway. Fine, take him. We don't care what you do with him. So then they bury him in a proper grave, a grave in which no man had yet laid. So that was this idea that he should have gotten this unjust burial, but he got a respectful burial. He made his grave with the wicked and the rich in his death. Second clause, mine has a semicolon and then it says because he did no violence. Everybody's Bible say because, although that's even better, much better. But really what he's saying is he's drawing attention to the irony of it. Here's this person who dies in the most ignominious way possible. The most disgusting, humiliating, you're a terrible kind of person. This is the electric chair, the worst of all kinds of deaths. This is reserved for the most disgusting criminals imaginable. He got this. The irony that the one who got that did no violence. Neither was any deceit found in his mouth. Like, what would you say made him worthy of this kind of death? What was the actual charges that led to his conviction? They nailed the little board, the little placard over their heads to say, this guy died for this reason, this guy died for that reason. What was the official Roman government's reason? Why did they kill Jesus? What does it say above his head?
King of the Jews.
For being the king of the Jews. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't say anything wrong. He didn't hurt anybody. He just made a statement that they couldn't disprove. And for that, the Romans allowed him to die. Verse 10. Yet it pleased the Lord. See how this follows? Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. The past 2, 3, 4 verses has been about the injustice of it all. And yet it pleases the Lord to bruise him. How can this please the Lord? Does your Bible say please the Lord?
Yeah.
With the will of the Lord.
What does it say exactly?
The will of the Lord.
Read it.
Yet it was the will of the
Okay.
Lord to crush him.
Which translation is that?
ESV.
Okay. Well, anybody have a different translation?
The Lord was willing.
The Lord was willing. This was, as much as, and I stand by everything I just said, as much as it was an act of barbarism and hatred and sinfulness, all that is true, it was used by God to accomplish the greatest good that could be done. God is not the one nailing his son to the cross. God is the one allowing sinners to nail him to the cross so that he can use that death as a sacrifice to save those sinners from the crime of killing him in the first place and all the other sins the world has ever done. God allowed this to happen. It therefore accomplished his will, and thus it pleased him. It was not, I'm happy this is happening. It's, as God always does, I can see the result of this. I can look beyond this and see what's going to come from it. God has that kind of perspective. He keeps trying to get us to have it too, and we just keep not having it because we get stuck in, I'm hurting right now, and God keeps saying, it'll be great, it'll be great, it'll be great. Yeah, but it hurts right now. His son is dying, but it's going to be okay. Thus it's okay. We got a lot more to say about that. We'll start in verse 10 next week, and we'll finish the chapter.